Welcome back. In the last lecture, we covered the opening pages of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and went over what we might consider as the outer layer of this frame tale, that of the explorer Walton and his voyage to the North Pole. Now, the novel moves into Victor Frankenstein's tale, which he is telling to Walton after his men have picked him up out of the Arctic Sea. And remember that Frankenstein isn't just telling the story for the fun of it. He's hoping to warn Walton, to instruct him from the circumstances of his own tragic life, because there's something in Walton that he sees that makes him think that Walton might be heading down the same path or in the same direction. So he begins his story all the way back at the beginning. We get a detailed account of his family and his family history. He has loving parents and two younger brothers, and his cousin Elizabeth lives with him as well. Alongside Elizabeth and his siblings and his best friend, Henry Clerval, Frankenstein passes a very happy childhood. We see a lot of emphasis in these opening chapters on the natural affection that his family members have for each other. The bond that Frankenstein feels for them, especially for Elizabeth and Clerval, is reminiscent of the yearning that Walton had had for a companion who could share in his journeys and in his dreams. Throughout this novel, we'll see that one of the themes that Mary Shelley develops is that isn't good for a person to be alone. That it's natural for us to be part of a group or have a connection of some kind, whether it be with a romantic partner, with a best friend, or with one's family. Because when we isolate ourselves from the people around us who care about us, then there's no one to reel us back in when we get off track in life's pursuits. There's no one to put a check on our worst impulses and ideas. We get the sense that if Frankenstein had been with Clerval or with Elizabeth when he went away to college, he probably wouldn't have embarked on his mad science experiment. But before we go into talking about that, I want to point out two important things that he mentions about his childhood. One is that of the education that he underwent. His father educated himself and his siblings, and the young Frankensteins had a passion for learning. It wasn't a chore to them. They had an intellectually stimulating childhood, immersed in poetry and languages and the sciences. Victor, in particular, was drawn toward the study of natural philosophy, which in modern day we would call science. One day, he chances across a book by a man named Cornelius Agrippa, who was a physician and a reputed magician from back in the Middle Ages, sometime around the 15th century, I think. The book fascinates Frankenstein, but his father dismisses it, calls it trash, and leaves it at that. Now, this is a terrible mistake to make with a young, inquiring mind eager for knowledge. It's a mistake that Victor now, in retrospect, recognizes. Talking about the remark that his father made and his dismissive attitude, he says this: "If, instead of this remark, my father had taken the pains to explain to me that the principles of Agrippa had been entirely exploded, and that a modern system of science had been introduced, which possessed much greater powers than the ancient, because the powers of the latter were chimerical, while those of the former were real and practical, under such circumstances I should certainly have thrown Agrippa aside, and with my imagination warmed as it was, should probably have applied myself to the more rational theory of chemistry, which has resulted from modern discoveries." In other words, if his father had taken the time to explain why he thought Agrippa was a bad read, Victor would have been more likely to take his word for it that it was outdated science. But since he just gave him a short answer, "No, that's no good," Victor assumed that his father hadn't read Agrippa himself or didn't know what he was talking about. This is something that I think a lot of teachers and sometimes parents do unconsciously, and it's an innocent enough mistake. If, for example, when you were younger and your parents told you not to touch the stove, and you asked why not, then they might have said something like, "because I said so," or "just don't do it." After all, your parents know perfectly well why you shouldn't touch the stove, right? And maybe they're busy with making dinner or doing something else at the time, so they don't have the patience to explain to you why touching it would be a bad idea. But when you're a little kid, that's not good enough of an answer. You don't know why you shouldn't touch the stove, and because I said so isn't an adequate response. And so you're tempted to touch it anyway, and you suffer the consequences for it. If Victor's father had been a bit more patient and explained why that one particular book was outdated, then maybe Victor would have trusted his judgment. But because he was rushed and he knew that the book was ridiculous, he gave an answer that may have been good enough for him, but wasn't good enough for his son. It's something to keep in mind if you've ever been in the position where you're having to tell someone what to do. Maybe you're babysitting, or maybe you're trying to explain something to a friend. Always remember to be patient and make sure that they understand why you're asking them to do something, so you're both on the same page and they don't decide that they know better than you and do something that you know to be stupid or wrong. Anyway, that's one of the things that happens in Victor's childhood. He becomes obsessed with science, and particularly with outdated science that borders on alchemy and magic. Another thing that happens is right before he goes away to school, his mother dies. This is the germ of the idea that he gets carried away with in college. He becomes obsessed with the idea of giving inanimate matter, corpses, the spark of life. He's seen death, he's felt it sting, to quote scripture, and I think this loss was no small part of what led him to the creation of his monster. So he goes to school, to the University of Ingolstadt, which had a reputation for hidden knowledge and for free thinking. It was a place that would have appealed to both Mary Shelley's father and to Percy Shelley as well. It was actually the birthplace of the Illuminati, a secret society that was founded there in 1776. So it's an appropriate setting for this tale of illicit or transgressing knowledge. When he's there, he meets new mentors, one of whom is a patient teacher, and who explains to him why his old favorites, even though they're a bit outdated, are still to be venerated for what they've contributed to the sum total of knowledge. And even though in this instance it leads to tragedy, this is the right attitude in general for a person who wants to be educated to have. Of course, there are some things that we know about today that they didn't know about 500 years ago. But this doesn't mean that the people who lived back then were any less intelligent than us. We wouldn't know as much as we know if they hadn't spent their lives going through the process of trial and error first. Sir Isaac Newton, the famous scientist, said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," meaning that the thinkers who came before him were the foundation by which he reached the height that he had. And really, that's what we're doing in this class as well. We're learning from these older writers and thinkers and philosophers in order to assimilate that knowledge and turn it to use in our own lives and in our own intellectual pursuits. It doesn't mean, again, we've talked about this before, that we have to agree with all that they have said or thought. In fact, I hope that you don't agree with a writer such as Friedrich Nietzsche or his philosophy, which we'll study later on in the year. It just means that understanding what has come before and what people have thought before better situates us to join the great conversation with our own new ideas that we come up with. So Victor is really inspired by this teacher, and for the next 2 years, he pursues his studies. He stops writing home. He begins neglecting his family and his friends because he's so eager to learn. And what follows in the next chapter or so is a really good account of what it's like to be caught up in an unhealthy obsession. Learning is a good thing, obviously, but when your whole life gets consumed with learning everything you can to the point where those bonds of natural affection are strained, then it's not good. He stops looking out the windows and seeing nature all around him. Again, things that he found fascinating when he was living a balanced, healthy life now no longer hold any fascination for him. It's kind of like how you'll hear drug addicts talk about their addictions. Everything else in the world ceases to matter. Family, food, pastimes. That's not important anymore. All that matters is the drugs. And Victor says, near the end of chapter 3, that this is the danger of passion, and that if you're someone who feels that your passion is dimming the other good things in your life, no matter what it is, you should cast it aside. He says, "A human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never to allow passion or transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections, and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful, that is to say, not befitting the human mind. If this rule were always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquility of his domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved, Caesar would have spared his country, America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed." So he gives this advice, and it's really good advice, and it shows us that Victor, who, keep in mind, is narrating all this, has learned the error of his ways and is now seeing things more clearly in retrospect. He eventually catches on to the ideas about galvanism and vitalism that we talked about last week. His mind has run away with visions of fame and glory, and he thinks that the secret of bestowing life has only been secret thus far due to cowardice and carelessness, and that he's the one to bring it to light. He dreams about the creation of a new species that will bless him as their creator, and then, almost as an afterthought, he mentions that if he can bestow life, perhaps he can eventually learn how to restore life. This ties back to the loss of his mother, which we talked about earlier. And it also ties back, I think, to a deep longing that Mary Shelley herself had. Around the time that she was writing this novel, she had just suffered a miscarriage, her first child with Percy. It was a devastating and traumatic event for her. No doubt she's transferring a bit of her own secret longing onto her character here. Maybe she would have liked to have the secret to restoring her child back to life. So, in the midst of Victor's great passion, his great obsession, he not only neglects others who care about him, but he neglects his own health. He becomes haggard and pale, and he forgets to eat. He's up at all hours of the night, either in his lab or in the cemetery. Charnel houses, the novel calls them. We get a really gruesome description of how he desecrates vaults and graves, dismembering corpses to study the process of decay and to pick out parts for his superhuman species. And remember that this is a man of supposed sensibility. He's supposed to have, and he does in fact have, refined feelings, ideas of virtue and respect and honor. But again, he's forgotten all of these in his obsession, and so he's driven to do these vile things that ordinarily he would never do and never even think about doing. Finally, the long-awaited night arrives, and he's ready to bring his project to completion. But then something unexpected happens. I'll read you the passage that starts at the beginning of chapter 4 at length, and pay attention to Victor's reaction to his success, because it's really interesting. He says, "It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. In this moment of triumph, he realizes that he's made a horrible mistake. What happened? If we take his word for it, he picked out body parts that were well formed, beautiful on their own. But when they all came together, why were they so hideous? There's actually two ways to interpret this, I think. One speaks to what we've already talked about, things being good and beautiful only if they're in their proper place or proper sphere. Let's say that you've really got a sweet tooth and you love chocolate. Having some chocolate every now and then is a good thing. It's a pleasure. But if you abuse it and don't just have it in its proper place or pacing and eat chocolate every day for every meal, it becomes something that's extremely bad for you and it'll probably turn your stomach. So maybe Victor picked out a face that was truly handsome on the person who it had originally belonged to. Maybe he picked out a beach bod with six-pack abs that conventionally people would say is an attractive body. But it was the unnatural combination of the two good things that made them turn hideous. That head didn't belong with that torso. They're out of their proper places, and so they became ugly. That's one interpretation, or one possibility. The other one is that the monster was always hideous, but Victor was so blinded by his passion that he couldn't see the truth until his mission was achieved. Again, think about drug addicts. They think the world is all bright and beautiful and they feel great when they're on whatever it is that they're on. But anyone who looks at them can see that they're wrecking their bodies and their minds. Most drug addicts are not healthy, good-looking people. Look at the mugshots. They look like zombies most of the time. And so when he's wrapped up in his own passion or in his own delusion, Victor saw his project as this great, beautiful thing. But as soon as the project ended and he looked on the results, he saw it for what it really always was. Something similar happens in the book of Genesis with Eve in the Garden of Eden. She sees the forbidden fruit and it's really enticing. Sin is always tempting. She sees the fruit and it looks good to eat, mouth-watering. She also wants the practical benefits that she's been told that it will grant her, to make her wise and knowledgeable. Not too different, really, from what Victor wants when you think about it. But the second that she takes that bite, she knows what sort of mistake she's made. And those initial moments of despair when the whole world around her seems to change and grow darker is captured really well in Milton's Paradise Lost. So after the creature comes to life, Victor flees. He's not thinking rationally at all. He leaves this potentially dangerous thing in his apartment to fend for itself at the risk of some other student stumbling across it, and he goes out for a walk. If the creation of the monster is Victor's first big mistake, this is his second. He runs from his problems. He's completely irresponsible and neglectful. He meets his friend Clerval, who has come to join the university as well, and for a while it seems that he's put the monster out of his mind entirely. This is kind of funny, or at least it's kind of odd. It's the ultimate example of the I'll deal with it later attitude. But we learn later in the novel that much might have been different if he had stepped up to the plate in these initial moments and taken responsibility for what he'd done. The monster might not have turned out to be a monster, or to act monstrously, I guess we could say. Things might have been really different. And it's another great lesson that this novel teaches. If there's something unpleasant that you have to do, that you know you should do, don't put it off, or else it will just become worse in the long run. Face your problems head on. Don't let them get out of control. And that's a lesson, again, that I think Victor ends up learning by the end, but it's too late to avert his fate or his destiny. Now we'll see next week just how out of control Victor's problems get. For the next time, read the rest of Volume 1 and the first 2 chapters of Volume 2. and we'll pick things up from there. Thanks for watching.